Long before China became a name on maps, people near the lower Yangtze shaped jade with patience that outlived their voices. They built walls, managed water, buried symbols, then left no readable story telling us who they were. The cold paradox is simple. Stone survived, but memory did not. A whole order of life reached for permanence and still became nearly nameless. So what came before China when an entire civilization carved jade cities and then vanished without a name? Before China became a word that could gather dynasties, borders, emperors, laws, and long-written histories into one familiar shape, there were older human worlds lying close to water, soil, and season. One of those worlds stood in the lower reaches of the Yangtze, where rivers loosened the earth, wetlands changed their edges, and rice fields depended on a careful bargain between people and water. The people who lived there did not leave us a sentence saying what they called themselves. They did not leave a king list that modern readers can follow from one name to another. They did not leave a book explaining why jade mattered, why walls rose where they did, or why certain dead were placed with objects that took enormous patience to make. What remains is quieter, and in some ways colder. Earthworks remain, buried foundations remain, water control structures remain. Polished jade remains. The name carried inside their own mouths does not. That is where the story must begin. Not with a lost empire imagined beyond evidence, but with a real archaeological silence that sits beneath later history like an old riverbed under a city street. To say before China is not to say before people, or before culture, or before intelligence. It means before the later political language by which much of this region would be remembered. Human beings had already been living, adapting, planting, burying, making, and teaching children how to survive for countless generations. The deeper origin of the human story was never a palace or a written record. It was the body learning place. Feet finding dry ground, hands testing clay, eyes reading clouds, stomachs depending on harvests, families remembering which water rose too high and which soil could be trusted. In the lower Yangtze, that older human pattern took on a form that was unusually organized. Communities did not simply pass through the wet land, they shaped it. They built in relation to it. They worked with rice, with timber, with earth, with channels, with embankments, and with the slow discipline of repeated labor. Yet the more organized this world appears in the ground, the more striking its silence becomes. A small village can disappear without leaving a name, and history may barely notice. But when walls, managed water, rich burials, and carved jade survive together, the absence of a self-given name feels different. It is as if the material world is speaking in full weight, while the human voice has been removed from it. The danger, then, is to rush into the silence and fill it with certainty. That would make the past easier to narrate, but less truthful. We do not know how a child there first learned the meaning of a jade object. We do not know what words were spoken at a burial. We do not know whether the people understood their city as a sacred center, a seat of authority, a home, a duty, or something no modern category can hold. What can be said is more modest, and perhaps more important for a long sleep story. Before the familiar written history of China, there were human communities in this landscape capable of creating durable forms of order. Their lives were not simple because they were early. Their world was not empty because it lacked a surviving name. Like all human beginnings, it grew from ordinary needs before it became visible as civilization. Food, shelter, water, kinship, memory, and the wish to make something last beyond one breath. And yet the strange balance remains. The harder their hands work to leave marks in jade and earth, the less we can hear the words that once made those marks meaningful. That balance will guide every step of this story, because the question is not whether these people were real. The question is how a real society can become visible to archaeology while remaining almost unreachable as a remembered voice, standing at the edge between human origin, early order, and historical loss. The phrase "before China" can sound like a door opening into myth, but it must be held with care. It does not mean that the land was empty before a later civilization arrived. It does not mean that human life suddenly began when a dynasty learned to write its records. It points instead to a deeper layer of time, when the region that would later be gathered under Chinese history was still made of many local worlds, each shaped by rivers, climates, materials, and habits of survival. In the lower Yangtze, one of those worlds became visible through Liangzhu. Modern archaeology gives it a name taken from a place of discovery, not necessarily the name its own people used. That difference matters. The word Liangzhu helps us speak, but it does not restore their own voice. It is a label placed from the outside, long after the hands that polished jade had returned to earth. This is why the title carries a quiet wound inside it. A civilization may be real, organized, and influential, yet still be nameless in the most personal sense. When later people wrote histories, they often wrote from courts, lineages, wars, rituals, and remembered rulers. But the Liangzhu world stood earlier than the secure written traditions that allow names to travel across thousands of years. It belongs to a time when human order could be built into land more easily than into readable text. The city, the waterworks, the burials, and the jade forms became the surviving language. They tell us that people coordinated labor, recognized status, shaped symbols, and lived within a shared system of meaning. They do not tell us the sound of a mother calling a child from a field, the word used for a leader, or the name spoken over the dead. For a sleep story about origins, this silence is not empty. It is the center of the evidence. Human beginnings are often remembered through what lasts least poorly: stone, bone, clay, pollen, soil, burnt remains, and carefully placed objects. Voices vanish first. Soft tools vanish. Daily gestures vanish. The ordinary knowledge that kept people alive passes away unless it is renewed through living bodies. When the chain breaks, the future receives fragments. In Liangzhu, the fragments are unusually rich, yet they remain fragments. The lower Yangtze setting helps explain why such fragments could gather into something larger than scattered villages. Rice agriculture created a close relationship between people and wet land. Water could feed the fields, carry materials, and connect settlements, but it could also flood, rot, divide, and destroy. To live there was to live inside a continuing negotiation with the environment. This is one reason the civilization should not be imagined as a sudden miracle. It was a human answer to place. Generation after generation, people learned how to remain near water without surrendering completely to it. They raised ground, organized space, buried the important dead, and gave jade a role that seems to have reached beyond ordinary decoration. None of this proves a simple state with modern borders or a single voice speaking for everyone. It only shows that shared order had become unusually visible. Each of these actions ties the story back to the old human beginning. The body facing the world, then slowly making a social memory around that struggle. Yet memory made of habit is fragile. It can survive in descendants and customs while losing its original name. It can influence later worlds without appearing in their records as a clear ancestor. So before China, in this careful sense, does not describe a blank before history. It describes a crowded darkness before names became stable enough to endure. In that darkness, Liangzhu stands like a low lamp, not bright enough to answer everything, but strong enough to show that the roots of civilization in this region reach deep into water, labor, jade, and silence. A named civilization is easier for the mind to hold. Egypt, Mesopotamia, Shang, Rome, Maya. Each name becomes a vessel. It gathers land, people, images, ruins, and memory into a shape that can be repeated. Liangzhu is different in a quieter way. The modern name gives us a handle but not a recovered identity. It lets archaeologists speak about a culture whose traces are concentrated around the lower Yangtze. Yet it does not tell us what those people heard when they named their own home. That missing word changes the feeling of the evidence. A wall without a remembered name is still a wall. A jade object without a surviving explanation is still the result of skill, patience, and meaning. A grave without a readable inscription still belongs to a human life once held inside a community. But each object arrives with a silence around it, and that silence must not be treated as permission to invent. The first careful answer to the title is therefore not a dramatic claim, but a boundary. Before China, there was not one simple darkness. There were many human worlds, many river valleys, many inherited ways of living, and many communities whose names did not survive into later written tradition. Liangzhu is one of the clearest windows into that older depth. It shows that in the lower Yangtze, people could organize labor, concentrate wealth, shape symbols, and build a landscape that carried social meaning. Yet the evidence also reminds us that civilization is not the same thing as being remembered clearly. The human body leaves traces by working. The hand polishes stone. The foot compacts a path. The back carries earth. The stomach depends on gravity. The family repeats a habit until it feels older than memory. Over generations, these bodily acts become fields, platforms, embankments, burial grounds, and objects placed with care. Archaeology often begins there, with the durable results of ordinary human effort. It can tell us that a community had the capacity to coordinate. It can show differences between graves, suggesting that some people held more status or ritual importance than others. It can reveal that jade was not scattered randomly, but placed in ways that likely belonged to a system of value. Still, it cannot safely give us the inner voice of a person standing beside a burial pit. It cannot translate emotion from polished stone. It cannot turn a symbol into a sentence unless a bridge of evidence exists. This is where the story must remain honest. The jade cities of this older world were not magical cities, and they were not proof of a forgotten superculture hidden from history. They were human achievements rooted in place, labour, ecology, and social order. Their strangeness comes not from fantasy, but from the fact that real complexity can exist before familiar names. A society can become large enough to redirect water, rich enough to bury fine objects, and organised enough to leave patterns in the soil, while still failing to send its own words across time. That is a colder thought than any invented mystery. It means memory is not guaranteed by achievement. Human beings have always tried to push against disappearance. A tool says, "I was here in action." A grave says, "Someone mattered." A wall says, "People returned to this boundary often enough to keep building it." A jade object says, "Time was spent beyond immediate hunger." These are not exact translations, but they are careful ways of listening to material evidence. In Liangzhu, such evidence gathers into a question that cannot be closed too early. What kind of society stood there before later historical names settled over the land? How did water, rice, labour, and jade become bound into one living order? And why, after so much effort to make the world stable, did the name of that order fall away, leaving only the shaped earth and the silent green stone? The lower Yangtze was not a dry stage on which a city simply appeared. It was a living, wet world, made of river branches, low ground, marsh edges, seasonal rain, and soil that could give food only when people learned its moods. To understand Liangzhu, the listener has to begin there, near water that was never just scenery. Water carried silt. Water fed rice. Water softened clay. Water opened paths between settlements, but it also blurred paths, swallowed fields, and returned each year as a force that could not be commanded by desire alone. The people of this landscape lived with a truth older than any state name. The human body survives by reading the environment before it can build a history. A foot learns where ground is firm. A hand learns the weight of wet earth. An eye learns the colour of a sky that may bring heavy rain. A family learns which raised place stays dry long enough for sleeping, storing, and burying. These lessons do not look grand at first. They begin as hunger, caution, repetition, and memory passed from one generation to the next. Yet from such small lessons, larger forms of life can grow. In a rice-growing world, survival was tied to timing. Seeds, water depth, labour, storage, and seasonal return all mattered. No single person could remake a wetland alone. The field needed many hands across many days. The settlement needed paths that did not vanish after rain. Food needed containers, places of keeping, and social habits that made work predictable. Long before written rulers could claim a land in records, people were already building order through shared attention to water and soil. This is one reason the Liangzhu world feels so important for the question before China. It shows that early civilization in this region did not rise away from nature, as if culture and environment were enemies. It rose inside a landscape that required careful cooperation. The wet ground shaped the people, and the people answered by shaping the wet ground. That answer did not need to be perfect. It only needed to endure long enough for fields to be planted again, houses to be repaired, children to learn, and older knowledge to become ordinary. Archaeology finds the later traces of that long exchange: platforms, walls, canals, embankments, storage remains, and settlements placed in relation to water. These traces are not the same as a living voice, but they show pressure and response. They show that human life there was organized around a difficult gift. Water made the lower Yangtze fertile, but fertility came with uncertainty. Too little water could weaken crops. Too much could turn the same place into danger. This tension is not a dramatic invention. It is the calm background against which the city must be seen. When people later carved jade, built raised spaces, and placed the dead with care, those acts rested on a more basic foundation: the steady work of remaining alive in a wet landscape. The origin of civilization is often imagined as a sudden leap into monuments. In the lower Yangtze, it is better understood as a slow thickening of daily dependence. The body needed food. The household needed shelter. The community needed memory strong enough to guide action when the water changed. Out of that need came habits, and out of habits came structures. The first city was not separate from the first field, and the first field was not separate from the first careful reading of mud, rain, and river. Before a name could survive in history, people had already built a relationship with place so deep that the land itself became an archive. Liangzhu begins, then, not with jade shining in a tomb, but with wet earth under human feet, and with the ancient effort to turn an unstable world into a home for one more quiet season of breath together. To live beside water for one season is a practical challenge. To live beside it for generations is a form of memory. In the lower Yangtze, people did not simply see rivers and wetlands as something outside themselves. Their bodies were trained by that world. Knees bent in mud. Hands carried baskets, tools, timber, and grain. Eyes judged whether a surface was safe to cross. Ears learned the sound of rain not as background music, but as information. The origin of human order often begins in such plain sensations. Before there are archives, there are repeated bodily lessons. Before there are titles, there are older people showing younger people where to step, when to plant, how to repair a bank, how to store food away from dampness, and how to return after water has changed the edge of a field. Liangzhu rose from this kind of accumulated knowledge. It should not be imagined as a sudden invention by people detached from daily need. It was more likely the visible result of habits that had become dense enough to shape space. Rice farming made those habits especially important. Rice does not grow from human wish alone. It asks for water, but not any water at any time. It asks for labour repeated through season after season, for fields that can hold moisture without becoming useless, for paths and storage places that allow a harvest to become tomorrow's survival rather than only today's meal. When many households depend on the same wet landscape, memory becomes social. A mistake is no longer only personal. A broken bank, a damaged field, or a failed store of grain can disturb many lives at once. This is where the story of a jade city begins to feel less like a mystery of objects and more like a history of coordination. Jade may catch the eye, but food made the community possible. Water management may seem technical, but underneath it was the ancient human fear of hunger and exposure. Every early society had to answer the same bodily questions. Where will we sleep? What will we eat? How will children live through the next change in weather? And how will what we learn today still be useful when we are gone? In the lower Yangtze, the answers were shaped by wet ground. People raised places above danger. They likely maintained routes, work areas, and boundaries in ways that archaeology can only partly recover. They created a landscape where built order and natural water were closely joined. This does not mean every person understood the whole system in one way. The evidence does not let us enter their private thoughts, but it does allow a careful conclusion. The Liangzhu world required more than isolated survival. It required inherited coordination, repeated labour, and a shared sense that certain places and actions mattered. That shared sense is one of the deepest roots of civilization. Human beings did not become builders of cities because they stopped being animals with fragile bodies. They built cities because the fragile body needed protection, food, continuity, and meaning. The same hand that lifted mud from a ditch could polish stone. The same community that organized harvests could also organize burials. The same memory that tracked water level could become attached to a wall, a platform, a grave, or a piece of jade. The wet world, therefore, gives the title its first quiet answer without closing the larger question. Before China, there were not silent, empty lands waiting for a name. There were human generations already binding body, environment, and memory together. Liangzhu was one powerful form of that binding, shaped by river country and made visible through earthworks, rice landscapes, and objects that outlasted speech. Yet if water helped make this order possible, it kept deeper uncertainty alive. The very force that fed the fields remained larger than the hands that tried to guide it. Water did not simply surround the Liangzhu world. It helped decide where life could become stable enough to gather. A settlement in wet country is never only a cluster of houses. It is a choice made again and again against softness, flooding, rot, distance, and hunger. Ground must be raised or selected, paths must remain usable, food must be protected from dampness. Burials must be placed where the dead can remain part of the remembered landscape. Work must be repeated before its purpose becomes visible to people born later. In this sense, the lower Yangtze was not merely a location, it was a teacher. It taught patience through seasons, caution through flood, and cooperation through the limits of a single body. No one body could hold back water for long. No one pair of hands could maintain a whole field system, move enough earth, repair every edge, and keep a community fed through uncertainty. The human beginning inside this story is therefore very simple. Our species survives by turning private weakness into shared method. A person tires. A household forgets. A generation dies. But if knowledge is carried through repeated practice, something larger than one life begins to take shape. Liangzhu belongs to that larger process. It shows how an environment can press human beings toward coordination long before later history gives them a familiar political name. The city that eventually became visible in the ground was not separate from the wet world around it. It was an answer to that world, built from earth, timber, rice, water, and social memory. The most important idea here is not that these people conquered nature. That would be too modern and too simple. They lived within a relationship that always remained uncertain. Water could be guided, stored, slowed, redirected, and expected in familiar patterns, but it could not be made obedient forever. The same channels that supported life depended on maintenance. The same lowland fertility that made rice possible kept reminding people that stability was temporary. This is why the rise of Liangzhu should be heard slowly. It was not a clean line from village to city, as if one stage replaced another overnight. It was more like a deepening footprint in wet ground. Repeated settlement made certain places important. Repeated planting made certain seasons powerful. Repeated labor made certain boundaries recognizable. Repeated burial made certain spaces heavy with memory. Over time, a landscape that had once been read mainly for survival could also become a landscape of authority and meaning. Archaeology lets us see some of that change, but only from the outside. It can show where platforms were built, where walls enclosed space, where waterworks altered flow, and where jade appeared in graves. It cannot tell us whether a worker felt pride, fear, duty, or simple exhaustion while carrying earth. It cannot tell us what a child thought when seeing a polished green object in the hands of an elder. Careful history must remain with what the evidence can bear. Yet even that careful evidence is enough to change the way we imagine early civilization. It did not begin only when someone wrote a royal name. It began wherever human groups made lasting arrangements around food, water, labor, death, and memory. In the lower Yangtze, those arrangements grew into something unusually complex. The wet world became a built world, though never fully separate from the waters that shaped it. This gives the next doorway in the story its quiet weight. Once people had learned to stay, plant, raise ground, guide water, and mark certain places as important, a different question emerges. How did scattered human labor become a center strong enough to leave behind walls, ordered spaces, and jade so carefully made that it still seems to hold the silence of hands long gone? A city rarely begins as a city in the minds of those who first prepare the ground. It begins as repeated return, People come back to a place because water can be reached, because food can be grown, because children can be kept near others, because the dead can be placed where memory will not immediately lose them. In the lower Yangtze, long before any later written history could gather the region into a familiar story, small agricultural communities had already learned to live with rice, wetlands, timber, clay, and seasonal uncertainty. Over time, some places became more important than others. A settlement might grow because it stood near useful water, because it could be defended from too much wetness, because paths converged there, or because families and leaders found reasons to keep returning. None of this requires us to imagine a sudden command from a legendary ruler. The safer and more human image is slower, households becoming neighborhoods, work areas becoming remembered spaces, repeated labor becoming a pattern large enough for archaeology to detect. Liangzhu appears to us from the ground as something far more organized than a loose scattering of homes. Its remains suggest planned spaces, raised platforms, walls, water-related works, and areas where ritual and burial carried special weight. Yet those traces should be approached gently. They do not let us watch the first day a boundary was marked. They do not tell us who gave instructions, who resisted them, or how many generations passed before a settlement became a center. They show the final weight of many decisions, not every breath that made them possible. This is where the story of early civilization comes closest to the deep origin of human life. Human beings are not strong because each body is enough by itself. A single body is brief, hungry, and vulnerable. Its strength grows when memory is shared, when labor is divided, when one person's effort fits into another person's task, and when a place becomes meaningful enough that people keep repairing it after damage. A village becomes more than shelter when it holds a social memory. A platform becomes more than raised earth when many hands return to maintain it. A wall becomes more than a barrier when it marks a difference between inside and outside, ordinary ground and chosen ground, scattered living and gathered order. In Liangzhu, that gathered order seems to have become unusually powerful. The city was not only a place to sleep, it was a landscape shaped by decision. Earth had been moved, water had been managed. Some dead were buried with objects that required great skill and time. Jade, clay, wood, grain, and soil all entered the same broad pattern of life. The people who made this world did not need a modern idea of a city to create one. They needed recurring work, shared expectations, and enough social pressure to make difficult projects continue beyond the energy of a single household. The result was a place where human life left heavier marks. This matters because the title asks about a civilization before China, and civilization is often imagined too narrowly. It is easy to look for writing first, kings first, armies first, names first. But in many early landscapes, complexity became visible through other signs. Built space, control of resources, craft specialization, burial differences, and the ability to organize labor across time. Liangzhu belongs to that kind of evidence. Its city was not voiceless because it lacked meaning. It is voiceless to us because its meanings did not survive in a form we can read. The movement from villages to a jade city was therefore also a movement from daily survival into durable social form. Rice fields fed bodies. Waterworks protected possibilities. Walls and platforms shaped space. Burials held memory in the earth. Jade carried value into places where ordinary tools would not have been enough. And still, beneath all these remains, there is no recovered name spoken from within the society itself. What survives is the shape of organization after the voice is gone. That is why Liangzhu feels both close and distant. Close because every mark begins with human hands. Distant because those hands built a center whose inner words remain beyond reach. The remains of Liangzhu ask us to think about a city without imagining streets full of familiar words. Modern people often picture a city as a named place, with records, officials, markets, and a map that fixes it in language. The older center in the lower Yangtze must be approached differently. Its organization is visible through ground, water, burial, craft, and pattern. The evidence suggests that people did not live as scattered families with no larger shared frame. Some spaces were chosen, prepared, raised, enclosed, or marked in ways that required planning and repeated labor. Yet the planning reaches us without a preserved voice explaining itself. A platform can show the earth was gathered and shaped, but it cannot tell us the word used for that place. A wall can show an inside and an outside, but it cannot tell us whether those meanings were political, ritual, practical, or mixed in ways no term can cleanly divide. A burial can show difference in treatment, but it cannot safely reveal the life of the person placed there. The city therefore appears through consequences rather than declarations. Human hands changed the land, and the changed land remained. In that quiet fact, we can see a deep stage in civilization's origin. People became able to leave heavier traces when their work was no longer only immediate. A house repairs a day. A field prepares a season. A store of grain protects a future. A wall, a raised area, or a water system suggests that the community had begun to work beyond hunger. Not in the form of philosophy we can quote, and not in thoughts we should pretend to hear, but in action repeated long enough to become structure. This is one of the safest ways to understand the movement from villages toward a jade city. It was a widening of time. The living had to coordinate with one another, but also with ancestors, children, seasons, and places made meaningful by earlier work. In a wet landscape, such coordination was not optional decoration. It helped keep the community alive. A path had value because feet would need it again. A raised place had value because water would return. A burial ground had value because memory needed a location. A craft tradition had value because skill had to pass through bodies before it could pass into objects. Jade makes this especially clear, not because it explains everything, but because it embodies time. It is not a material shaped casually. Its polish and form point to patience, skill, and a social world that could support labor beyond simple survival. Still, jade should not be treated as a code already solved. The forms found in Liangzhu burials, including objects often described today as cong and bi, show that certain shapes carried importance. They do not allow us to translate that importance into exact sentences. The honest listener remains with the space between skill and meaning. Liangzhu was not silent because nothing happened there. It is silent because what happened there was not preserved as readable speech. That silence becomes more powerful beside the scale of organization. A community that could maintain a city, manage water, grow rice, differentiate burials, and produce refined jade objects was not outside history in the human sense. It was outside the latest stream of self-explaining texts that people rely on to feel close to the past. Here, closeness has to come from another route. We come near through the body, carrying earth, polishing stone, fearing failed crops, and feeling relief when ground stays dry after rain. These are not invented emotions, but careful human bridges from evidence to experience. They remind us that every civilization, named or nameless, begins with bodies trying to continue. In Liangzhu, those bodies built a center strong enough to survive as archaeological form, yet fragile enough that its own name did not cross the long distance. The more carefully Liangzhu is viewed, the less it looks like a single mystery waiting for one dramatic solution. It looks instead like a human center made from many kinds of order resting on top of one another. There was the order of food, because rice and storage tied people to season and place. There was the order of water, because wet ground had to be watched, guided, and answered. There was the order of space, because some areas were raised, enclosed, or treated as more important than ordinary ground. There was the order of death, because burials were not all alike, and some graves received objects that demanded rare skill and long preparation. There was the order of craft, because jade did not become smooth and shaped without trained hands, repeated technique, and time taken away from simpler tasks. None of these signs by itself gives us a full society. Together, they reveal a center where life had become organized beyond the small circle of immediate need. Yet even here, the evidence keeps its quiet distance. We can see that space was shaped, but not hear the meeting where a decision was made. We can see that jade was valued, but not know the complete meaning held inside its forms. We can see that some people were treated differently in death, but not safely name the stories told about them while they lived. This distance should make the story calmer, not weaker. It protects the past from being turned into a fantasy built for modern excitement. The real wonder is already enough. Before the better-known written traditions of later China, people in the lower Yangtze built a complex world whose structure can still be traced without its own sentences surviving. That fact brings us back to the older origin of human civilization. Human beings began as bodies in landscapes, not as names in books. The first lasting orders came from repeated needs: a place to sleep, a way to eat, a method for sharing work, a memory of danger, a care for the dead, and a hope that children would inherit more than confusion. Liangzhu took those human needs and made them visible at a larger scale. Its city was not simply a collection of shelters, it was a material arrangement of trust, pressure, status, labour, and memory. People must have returned to the same places often enough for the places to gain weight. They must have worked in ways that connected households to something larger than one household. They must have accepted, inherited, or lived within differences that left marks in burial and craft. But the exact language of those connections is gone. In this way, Liangzhu stands at a threshold. On one side is the ordinary human world of mud, grain, water, family, and breath. On the other side is the world of cities, symbols, authority, and lasting architecture. Between them is not a clean line, but a slow accumulation. A raised platform becomes a remembered place. A boundary becomes part of how people move. A grave becomes part of how a community understands loss. A jade object becomes more than stone because hands, time, and social meaning gather around it. The city did not need to explain itself to the future in order to be real. It only needed to function in its own time, for its own people, under the conditions of its own landscape. The tragedy is that functioning is not the same as being remembered. Many societies have lived with deep intelligence and still left no readable account of themselves. Many human names have passed through air once, then disappeared as completely as breath in cold morning light. Liangzhu left something firmer than breath, but less complete than speech. It left the shape of a built world. It left the pressure of organized labor in the ground. It left the green patience of jade. And as the story moves from the city itself toward the objects placed within its most careful spaces, the question becomes quieter and more precise. If a people's words are gone, how much memory can stone be asked to carry? Jade enters this story quietly, but it changes the weight of everything around it. In the Liangzhu world, jade was not only a beautiful material found by chance in the ground, it was shaped with such care, placed in such meaningful settings, and associated so often with high-status burials that it has become one of the strongest surviving signs of that society's inner order. Yet this is also where caution matters most. A polished object can survive for thousands of years, but the thought attached to it can vanish in one generation if no living tradition carries it forward. When modern eyes look at a piece of Liangzhu jade, they see colour, surface, form, and skill. They may see objects now called cong, often squared outside and hollow within, or bai, round discs with central openings. They may see incised motifs, repeated forms, and a level of workmanship that makes casual explanation feel inadequate. But the object does not speak its own sentence. It does not tell us the exact prayer, rule, memory, rank, or story that once surrounded it. This silence is not a weakness in the evidence. It is the evidence asking to be treated honestly. Jade tells us that people invested time beyond immediate hunger. It tells us that some materials mattered more than others. It tells us that certain graves, certain bodies, and certain spaces were marked with objects difficult to make. It tells us that craft and social difference had become deeply linked. What it cannot safely tell us is the complete meaning inside a vanished mind. The human origin behind jade is still bodily and simple. Before symbol becomes symbol, a hand must learn pressure. Before a surface shines, eyes must judge smoothness. Before an object is placed with the dead, living people must spend food, time, and labour on something that will not feed a child or repair a roof. That choice is important. It means the community had room, or at least obligation, for work beyond survival alone. In every early society, such work marks a shift. People do not stop needing food. They do not stop fearing weather, sickness, or loss. But they begin to carry meaning into objects, and then those objects begin to organize memory. Jade is especially powerful because it is hard, slow, and enduring. It resists the body, and in resisting, it records patience. A hurried life may still produce tools, shelters, and meals. A jade tradition suggests a longer rhythm, one in which skill is taught, value is recognized, and certain forms are worth repeating. This does not require us to imagine mystery beyond evidence. The deeper wonder is ordinary enough to be true. Human beings used fragile hands to shape a material that would outlast nearly everything soft about them. Skin disappeared, voices disappeared. Wooden tools, woven things, spoken names, daily gestures, and many memories disappeared. Jade remained. That contrast is the cold heart of the Liangzhu story. The people were not trying to communicate with us in a language we can easily read. They were acting within their own world. Still, their objects crossed the distance that their words did not. They reached us not as explanations, but as proof of concentration. A jade object in a burial says that time was gathered around one person, one role, or one ritual place. It says that someone's position in death could be made visible through material endurance. It says that a society had learned to turn labor into symbolism, and symbolism into lasting form. Before later, China would be known through texts, dynasties, and named rulers. This older world left a different record. Green stone made smooth by human patience, carrying meaning we can sense but cannot fully translate. In that narrow space between what remains and what is lost, jade becomes the memory that stone could carry. Not a full confession from the past, but a durable trace of human order before its own name disappeared. The patience inside Liangzhu jade can be understood only if we remember the body that made it. Jade is not soft clay taking shape under quick fingers. It is a resistant material, and resistance changes time. Every smooth edge suggests repeated contact between hand, tool, water, grit, and attention. Every polished surface points to hours that cannot be recovered as speech. The maker's name is gone, but the discipline of the maker remains inside the object like a quiet pressure. This is one of the most human things about the Liangzhu world. It shows a society in which some labor was directed toward objects that were not meant for ordinary use alone. A bowl can hold food. A tool can cut, scrape, or dig. A roof can keep rain from the sleeping body. Jade objects in elite burials belong to a different kind of need. They point toward value, rank, ritual, memory, and social meaning, even if the exact meaning cannot be safely translated. In this way, jade asks us to think about civilization as something more than food production or settlement size. A community becomes more complex when it can organize labor around ideas that cannot be eaten, worn for warmth, or used to pull water from a ditch. That does not make those ideas unreal. Human beings have always lived by more than hunger, even while hunger remains the first law of the body. The origin of symbolic life begins when a group gives material form to what it considers important. In Liangzhu, jade appears to have carried that weight. Some graves contained far more and finer jade than others, suggesting that the society marks difference in death with objects that required rare effort. This is not enough to reconstruct personal biographies. It does not let us say what a buried person believed, feared, hoped, or remembered, but it does show that the dead were not treated as equal surfaces in the ground. Certain bodies were surrounded by durable signs. Certain objects were chosen to travel with them into burial. The living gave labor to the dead, and that gift left a record. Here, the cold paradox of the story deepens. The objects may have been made to serve meanings within Liangzhu life, not to explain Liangzhu to the distant future. Yet because they were made of stone, they became the messengers that survived. The soft world around them vanished. The spoken instruction passed from elder to child vanished. The social pressure that told a craft worker how carefully to shape a form vanished. The gatherings, silences, gestures, and rules around burial vanished. What remains is the hard residue of importance. We can touch the edge of the system, but not the center of its voice. This is why a careful listener should not ask jade to say too much. It is tempting to make each form into a complete story, to imagine that every line carries a known message and every object reveals a fixed belief. But the safer truth is quieter. Jade shows the existence of meaning, not the full content of meaning. It shows that hands were trained, time was gathered, status was marked, and memory was placed into matter. It shows that before later written history made names more stable, people in the lower Yangtze had already learned to make value visible through craft. This connects Liangzhu to the wider human beginning. Across the world, early communities found ways to place more than function into objects. A stone, a shell, a pigment mark, a burial gift, or a carved form could become a way of holding attention beyond the immediate moment. Such things help people remember who belonged, who mattered, what was owed, and where the living stood in relation to the dead. Liangzhu jade belongs to that deep human pattern, but in a highly developed local form shaped by its own landscape and society. It is not a universal language we can read perfectly. It is a local memory we can approach only through evidence, and perhaps that is why it feels so still. Jade did not save the names of its makers. It saved the trace of their patience, and the fact that their world had learned to give permanence to meaning. Jade gives Liangzhu one of its most enduring faces, but it also reminds us how uneven survival can be. A house may collapse until only a stain in the ground remains. A wooden tool may rot until no one can guess how often it was held. A woven mat, a spoken name, a gesture of respect, a rule taught in a low voice, all can pass away without leaving a mark that can be recovered. Jade resists that fading. It stays, not because it remembers in the human sense, but because its material body is stubborn. This stubbornness can tempt the modern mind to treat it as an answer. Yet, jade is better understood as a boundary between knowledge and loss. It confirms that people in Liangzhu could gather skill, labour, rank, and symbolic attention into durable objects. It does not let us enter the full meanings those objects carried when they were placed beside the dead. The safest way to listen to jade is to let it remain both clear and incomplete. Clear, because it shows a society capable of refined craft and unequal distribution of precious things. Incomplete, because the social world that made those things meaningful no longer speaks in its own language. This is not a failure of the past. It is part of the condition of being human. Our species has always tried to make memory survive outside the body, because the body is brief. A child learns by watching hands. A craft worker learns by repeating pressure. A community learns by returning to the same forms until they become familiar. But when the chain of teaching breaks, objects remain without the living breath that once explained them. In Liangzhu, jade became one of the few carriers strong enough to cross that break. It does not carry everything. It carries effort. It carries selection. It carries the fact that some objects were worth more time than others, and that some people were given more lasting signs than others. That is already a serious statement about early civilization. It tells us that before names were fixed in written history, human groups in the lower Yangtze were already arranging the world into visible layers of value. The field fed the body. The water system helped protect the field. The city gathered work and memory. The grave held the dead in social order. Jade gave some of that order a surface that would endure. Still, none of these layers should be turned into a simple conclusion. We do not know whether a jade form was understood in exactly one way by everyone who saw it. We do not know whether its meaning changed from one generation to another. We do not know whether its power came from ancestry, ritual practice, authority, beauty, tradition, or several of these together. Careful history does not close those spaces with invented certainty. It lets the silence remain where the evidence ends. That silence gives Liangzhu much of its depth. A nameless civilization is not an empty civilization. A silent object is not a meaningless object. The loss of explanation does not erase the reality of the hands that shaped it. When we look at Liangzhu jade, we are looking at a long human argument against disappearance, made without paper, without surviving sentences, and without a name that can be confidently restored. The argument did not fully succeed. The people still vanished from memory as speakers of their own story, but it did not fully fail either. Something remained heavy enough to be found. Something green and polished still holds the evidence of patience, after so many seasons of touch, fatigue, attention, and inherited skill. As the story turns from the object to the labour inside it, the most important question becomes less mysterious and more human. What kind of bodies, days, and repeated work were required to make stillness look so effortless? The stillness of Liangzhu jade can make its making almost disappear. A polished object rests in a museum case or in a photograph as if it had always been calm, as if smoothness were its natural state. But nothing about such an object was effortless. Behind the quiet surface was a body working against resistance. An eye had to notice unevenness. A hand had to repeat pressure. A shoulder had to hold a posture long enough for fatigue to settle into the work. Water, abrasive material, and tool edges had to meet stone again and again before a hard surface could turn into something controlled. The finished object hides the strain that made it possible. This hidden labor is important because it pulls the story away from fantasy and back toward human life. Liangzhu does not need to be mysterious in a theatrical way. It is already profound because its refined objects were made by vulnerable bodies with limited strength, limited time, and inherited skill. The origin of civilization begins there as much as in any wall or burial, in the ability of human groups to direct the effort of bodies toward purposes larger than immediate survival. A hungry body wants food. A tired body wants rest. A wet body wants shelter. Yet early communities also gave labor to things that carried meaning, status, memory, or obligation. Jade belongs to that larger use of human energy. It required someone to spend hours on a material that would not grow rice, stop rain, or fill a stomach. For that to happen repeatedly, the society around the maker had to support, demand, or value such work. This does not tell us the maker's personal place in society. It does not tell us whether the worker was honored, directed, burdened, trained by kin, or attached to a specialist tradition in a way we can clearly define. The evidence does not reach that far. But it does show that craft was not a casual side note. The objects are too careful, too repeated, and too closely tied to important burials to be treated as ordinary decoration. They reveal time made visible. Every culture that survives only through objects leaves this kind of problem. The object remains, while the working day vanishes. We cannot hear the scraping. We cannot see the dust on skin. We cannot know how many attempts failed or how a young person learned the first patient movement. Still, the jade lets us think carefully about the body behind civilization. Human beings did not build complex worlds because they escaped the body. They built them by organizing the body, feeding it, training it, assigning tasks, repeating movements until technique became tradition. In the lower Yangtze, where rice and water already required seasonal coordination, the same social capacity could support craft. A community able to maintain fields and manage wet ground could also create conditions for specialized work. Food surplus, shared authority, inherited expectations, and unequal access to valued goods may all have played roles, though the exact arrangement cannot be stated with certainty. What can be said is that jade objects concentrate labor in a small space. A wall spreads work across land. A water system spreads work across a whole environment. A jade object gathers work into the palm of a hand. Its size may be modest, but its making carries a long rhythm of human attention. This is why the beauty of Liangzhu jade should be heard slowly. It is not simply visual beauty, it is biological time transformed into material form. Breath after breath, movement after movement. The body gave a share of its living hours to stone. When that stone was placed in a grave, the labor of the living crossed into the space of the dead. The maker's name disappeared. The owner's exact story disappeared. The words spoken around the object disappeared. But the discipline of repeated human action remained sealed in the smoothness. Beneath the green stillness, Liangzhu leaves one of the oldest lessons of civilization. What looks effortless to the future may once have cost many lives their quiet hours. The labor inside jade was small enough to fit inside the hand, but Liangzhu also required labor too large for one body to imagine alone. Earth had to be moved. Ground had to be raised. Water edges had to be shaped and repaired. Fields had to be planted, watched, harvested, and made ready again after the season turned. If jade shows patience concentrated in an object, the built landscape shows patience spread across many bodies. This is where the quiet surface of the civilization becomes heavier. A wall does not rise because one person wishes for a wall. A platform does not become stable because one household carries a few baskets of soil. A water system does not continue because a single worker understands a channel. These things require repetition, direction, habit, and some kind of shared expectation strong enough to bring people back to the same task after tiredness. The body remains at the center. A person carrying earth feels weight before any future archaeologist calls the result architecture. A person repairing a wet boundary meets mud, strain, and weather before anyone names the place a city. A person harvesting rice works with hunger behind the task, because grain is not an idea, it is survival stored in a form the body can use later. Early civilization grew from that closeness between physical need and social order. In Liangzhu, the signs of organization do not float above daily life, they rest on it. The jade object, the burial, the wall, the field, the managed water, and the raised ground all depend on bodies being fed, directed, and returned to work. This does not mean everyone worked in the same way, or that every person shared equally in the results. Burial differences suggest that social inequality existed in some form, though its exact rules remain beyond reach. Some people were placed with more valuable objects than others. Some spaces appear to have carried more importance than ordinary living ground. These patterns imply that labour and value were not distributed as a flat surface. Yet careful history cannot turn those patterns into a full story of personal lives. We cannot safely say how each worker understood duty, status, pressure, or belonging. We can only see that the society was capable of organising effort beyond the household scale. That ability is one of the oldest thresholds in human history. A family can survive by working together. A village can endure by sharing local memory. But a larger centre requires labour to be coordinated across people who may not all know one another closely. It requires trust, authority, obligation, or tradition strong enough to move hands in the same direction. It requires the present body to work for a structure whose full value may appear only later. This is a profound human arrangement. The living give their strength to something that will remain after their own strength is gone. In the lower Yangtze, that arrangement was tied to water and rice as much as to jade and burial. The community could not create symbolic wealth without the ordinary wealth of food and maintained land. It could not support craft without seasons of production. It could not build durable spaces without bodies returning again and again to the same physical problems. The calmness of the ruins can hide this. Archaeological plans show lines, forms, layers, and locations. They make the past appear still. But the real past was movement. Carrying, bending, cutting, planting, smoothing, digging, lifting, weighting, repairing. The human origin of Liangzhu is found in that movement. It is not only in the rare object or the impressive structure, but in the repeated use of muscle and memory until a wet landscape became ordered enough to hold a civilization. And because the names of those workers are gone, their labour becomes even more important. It is one of the few ways they still enter the story, not as kings or legends, but as bodies whose quiet effort gave shape to a world that later lost its voice. The labour of Liangzhu should not be imagined only as hardship, because hardship alone cannot explain form. Many people in many places worked hard and left few traces that look like a city. What makes Liangzhu important is that labour appears to have been held inside a continuing order. Bodies did not simply exhaust themselves against mud, stone, and season. Their efforts were drawn into patterns. Fields renewed, water controlled, ground raised, objects shaped, burials prepared, and places returned to with enough regularity that memory settled into the landscape. This is the quieter meaning of civilization before a surviving name. It is not only that people worked, it is that work became organized across time. The single body is always temporary. It wakes, hungers, tires, heals, ages, and disappears. A civilization begins to appear when temporary bodies produce arrangements that outlive them. In the lower Yangtze, those arrangements were made in wet earth and polished jade, in food systems and burial customs, in the practical need to live near water, and the social need to give some places greater weight than others. The labour hidden inside stillness, therefore, belongs to several scales at once. At the smallest scale, there is the hand holding a tool against stone. At the household scale, there is the daily work of food, shelter, storage, and care. At the community scale, there is the maintenance of fields, paths, raised areas, and water edges. At the larger social scale, there is the ability to direct effort toward projects whose value could not belong to one person alone. These layers make Liangzhu feel less like a puzzle of lost secrets, and more like a record of human coordination under pressure. The pressure came from environment, because water could not be ignored. It came from biology, because bodies needed food and safety before they could give time to ritual or craft. It came from memory, because each generation depended on knowledge received from people who would not always be there to correct them. It may also have come from hierarchy, because the archaeological record shows differences in burial treatment and access to valued objects. That last point must remain careful. Inequality can be seen in patterns, but not translated into a full moral drama without evidence. We cannot know the private experience of every worker, maker, leader, farmer, or mourner. What we can say is that Liangzhu required many forms of effort to meet in one social world. The calm object and the calm ruin both hide motion. A jade surface hides rubbing, grinding, checking, and repeating. A platform hides baskets of earth and countless steps. A rice landscape hides planting, tending, harvesting, drying, storing, and beginning again. A burial hides the living work of preparing the dead and deciding what material signs should remain with them. The vanished name of the civilization makes this labor even more central, because labor is one of the few voices still left. It does not speak in words, but in consequences. The consequences say that people once gave their living hours to a world they believed, or were required, to maintain. They did not know that later listeners would search for them through soil and stone. They did not need to know. Their world was built for their own days, their own obligations, their own dead, their own seasons of water rising and falling. And still, by working within those days, they left traces that reach far beyond them. This is the gentle lesson carried from jade into earth. Permanence is often made by fragile bodies that never become permanent themselves. The city remained as a pattern after the hands were gone. The objects remained as polish after the breath was gone. The labour remained as form after the names were gone. And when we ask why a civilization before China could carve jade cities and still vanish without a name, we are also asking why human work can last longer than human memory. Water was the first great test of power in the Liangzhu world. Not power in the later sense of written laws, armies, titles, and royal names fixed in records, but power as the ability to gather human effort around a force larger than any person. In the lower Yangtze, water could not be ignored. It moved through low ground, filled fields, softened earth, fed rice, and threatened the same places it made fertile. To live there was to live with a question that returned every season. How can fragile bodies remain near a force that gives life without letting that force take everything back? Liangzhu's water management works make that question visible in the land. Archaeologists have identified large structures connected with controlling, storing, slowing, or guiding water around the settlement landscape. Such works suggest planning beyond the needs of a single household. They also suggest memory reaching across seasons, because water control is never finished once and for all. A bank can break, a channel can clog, a raised place can settle, a field can become too wet or too dry. The system has to be watched, repaired, and understood by people who inherit the labour of those before them. Here, the origin of civilization appears not as a throne, but as coordination under environmental pressure. One person may know where water rises. One family may repair a small edge, but a larger system requires many hands moving according to shared expectation. Someone, or some group, had to decide where effort should go. Someone had to persuade, command, obligate, or organize others. The exact structure of that authority is not preserved in words, and careful history must not invent it. Yet the landscape itself shows that loose action was not enough. Waterworks of this scale are social facts written in earth. They do not reveal the names of leaders, but they reveal the presence of organized direction. This is why water management and power are difficult to separate. A community that can shape water can also shape time. It can make planting more predictable. It can protect stored effort from sudden loss. It can create safer ground for living and working. It can bind people to maintenance tasks that return again and again. In such a world, control over water may have been tied to control over food, labour, status, and ritual importance, though the exact arrangement remains beyond secure recovery. The wet landscape did not merely require technical skill. It required social trust, discipline, and probably hierarchy. The body stands at the centre of this again. Water management is often described in distant terms, but its daily reality would have been physical: carrying earth, cutting materials, clearing channels, watching levels, repairing damage, moving through mud, returning after rain. The human body had to do the work before the community could enjoy the order. Every early civilization depended on this exchange. The living body gives strength to a structure, and the structure gives the body a greater chance to continue. In Liangzhu, that exchange seems especially clear because the environment made water both wealth and danger. Rice fields were not separate from authority. They were one reason authority could matter. A society able to guide water could help decide whether grain survived, whether settlement ground remained usable, and whether people trusted the future enough to invest labour in craft, burial and construction. This does not mean water alone, explains Liangzhu. Jade, graves, architecture, food production, and regional networks all belong to the wider picture. But water gives the city its physical logic. It explains why cooperation had to become durable. It shows why early order in this region was rooted in landscape rather than floating above it. Before China became a historical name, people in the lower Yangtze had already learned that civilization could begin with a ditch, a bank, a field edge, and a shared memory of flooding. The jade may look more beautiful, but the waterworks carry a different kind of truth. They show a society trying to make uncertainty livable. They show human intelligence spread across soil rather than written across paper. And they show that one of the oldest forms of power was not the ability to tell a story about the world, but the ability to keep water from ending it. The waterworks around Liangzhu make power visible without giving power a surviving voice. They do not tell us the name of a ruler. They do not preserve an order spoken by an official. They do not explain whether decisions were made through lineage, ritual authority, practical leadership, inherited rank, or some combination that no modern word can hold neatly, yet they show that decisions had consequences in earth. When people move soil on a large scale, build embankments, guide water, or maintain channels across more than one season, society has already become more than a gathering of households living side by side. It has learned to direct effort through time. That is a quiet but serious threshold. A single family may remember a flood. A village may repair a damaged edge. But a regional water system asks something larger of human beings. It asks them to trust instructions beyond their own doorway. It asks them to work for fields they may not personally harvest, for walls they may not personally use, and for safety that only appears when many small actions hold together. The origin of human cooperation lies inside such arrangements. Our species did not become powerful because each body became stronger than water, hunger, or weather. It became powerful because bodies could be joined by memory, rule, habit, and expectation. Liangzhu's wet landscape made that joining necessary. Water came as a force that could not be negotiated with in words. It answered only to ground height, channel direction, rainfall, slope, storage, release, and repair. To manage it, people had to turn knowledge into labour. They had to recognize patterns, remember failures, and prepare before danger arrived. This kind of preparation changes a community. It gives weight to those who understand timing. It gives importance to those who can call others to work. It makes maintenance a social duty rather than a private choice. Over generations, such duties can become part of authority. Again, the evidence does not allow us to draw a clear portrait of government in the modern sense, but it does allow us to see that Liangzhu's order was not only symbolic, it was practical, physical, and seasonal. The same society that placed jade in important graves also had to keep water in forms that made life possible. The polished object and the muddy bank belonged to one world. One carried value into burial, the other helped protect the living from disorder. Both required organized time, both required bodies trained by repetition. Both suggest that some people, some places, and some actions held more weight than others. This is where water management becomes more than engineering. It becomes a way to think about social structure. If water feeds rice, and rice feeds bodies, then control over water touches the base of life itself. It touches the stomach before it touches status. It touches childhood, storage, labour, and survival before it becomes a symbol of leadership. Early human communities everywhere had to solve the same basic problem: how to make tomorrow less uncertain than today. In the lower Yangtze, tomorrow depended on wet fields and controlled flow. A failed system could mean damaged crops, unstable ground, lost stores, or the need to move. A working system could allow people to stay, gather, specialize, bury their dead with care, and spend time on objects that did not directly feed them. In this sense, water supported jade before jade could become a sign of power. The most refined craft rested on the most ordinary need. The ability to carve meaning into stone depended on the ability to keep bodies alive through seasons. Liangzhu should therefore be understood not as a civilization floating above its environment, but as a social order woven tightly into it. Its power was not proven only by what looked impressive. It was proven by the slow coordination required to make wetland livable again and again. The human cost of that coordination is mostly invisible now. We see the remaining forms, not the arguments, fatigue, repairs, orders, refusals, or teaching that may have shaped them. We see the outcome, not the living process. But the outcome is enough to say that before later historical names, this region already held a society capable of turning environmental risk into organized action. And that may be one of the oldest meanings of civilization, not escape from nature, but the long attempt to live with a power that can never be fully possessed. The water system brings the Liangzhu story to a quiet edge. It shows a society strong enough to organize land, yet still living under conditions it could never completely master. That balance is important. If we imagine early civilization only as triumph, we miss the deeper human truth inside it. People can guide water, but they do not own rain. They can raise banks, but they cannot promise that every season will respect them. They can remember past floods, but they cannot know every future pattern. In the lower Yangtze, life depended on this uneasy relationship between skill and uncertainty. The same water that made rice possible also kept human order humble. This is why the waterworks matter so much to the title's question. Before later China was remembered through written courts and dynasties, a different kind of historical intelligence had already appeared in the landscape. It was not written in ink. It was built into earth. It rested in embankments, channels, raised ground, and the social habits needed to keep them useful. The people who maintained such a world were working with one of the oldest problems of our species: how to make a place stay livable when nature keeps moving. The human body cannot survive long in pure uncertainty. It needs food stored ahead of hunger. It needs ground that can be trusted beneath the feet. It needs shelter that will still stand after rain. It needs other bodies close enough to share work, defend memory, and carry knowledge forward. Water management gathered all these needs into one practical system. It joined stomach, hand, season, field, and authority. A ditch was not only a ditch if it helped decide whether a harvest survived. A bank was not only earth if many families depended on its holding. A raised place was not only architecture if it kept the living, and perhaps the dead within a stable landscape. Through water, civilization became physical before it became historical in the written sense. Yet the same evidence that shows power also hints at vulnerability. Any system that depends on maintenance contains the possibility of failure. It has to be renewed by people who may face heavier rain, changing channels, soil problems, social strain, or pressures that cannot all be recovered now. The end of Liangzhu should not be reduced too early to one simple cause, and it should not be told as if modern listeners can watch a final day. The safer path is to understand the tension already present in its rise. This was a civilization deeply tied to water. Its success made sense because of water, and its risks also gathered there. The environment did not stand outside the city like a background. It entered the city's food, labor, authority, and future. That is why water management is more than an impressive technical achievement. It is a reminder that early human order was always negotiated, never guaranteed. People built systems to hold back disorder, but those systems depended on living hands, shared memory, and seasons kind enough to remain within expected limits. When the hands were gone, the structures remained only as evidence. When the names were gone, the earth still kept the outline of effort. Liangzhu's waterworks therefore carry a double message. They show how far coordination had gone before familiar historical names settled over the region. They also show how close every early civilization remained to the forces that fed it. In the end, power over water was never absolute power. It was a long conversation between human need and moving earth, between planned order and returning rain, between the hope of permanence and the quiet knowledge that every bank must be repaired again. The graves of Liangzhu bring the story from water and labour into a more difficult kind of silence. A field can show how people survived. A wall can show how people gathered space. A water system can show how effort was coordinated across seasons. But a grave asks another question. How did a community see difference among its own dead? In Liangzhu, archaeologists have found burials that were not all treated in the same way. Some contained many jade objects and other signs of special treatment, while others were far simpler. This does not allow us to rebuild a full social world in exact detail. It does not tell us the private life of the person buried, the words spoken over the body, or the emotions of those who stood nearby, but it does show that death did not erase social difference. Some people entered the ground with more durable signs around them than others. That fact is quiet, but it changes the meaning of the city. Liangzhu was not only a place where people farmed rice, managed water, and shaped jade. It was also a place where value appears to have been distributed unequally, and where certain bodies were marked with objects that required unusual time and skill. The human origin of this pattern is older than cities. Every human group has to decide, in some way, how to remember the dead. A body stops breathing, but the living remain with grief, obligation, fear, memory, and the need to place loss somewhere. Burial is one way human beings have turned biological death into social action. It gives the living a task when the body can no longer answer. It places the dead within a landscape, and it can also show how a community understood rank, belonging, ancestry, or importance. In Liangzhu, the presence of rich jade objects in some graves suggests that certain individuals or groups held special status. Yet careful speech is necessary here. We should not imagine complete biographies where the evidence gives only patterns. We should not turn every rich grave into a known ruler, priest, or warrior unless the material record supports such certainty. The safer statement is that Liangzhu society appears to have been stratified, with differences visible in burial treatment and access to valued objects. That alone is enough. It means the city's order reached beyond water and work into the way people were placed after death. Inequality is often easier to see in archaeology than ordinary life, because power leaves heavier traces. The poor, the young, the old, the sick, the workers, and the people whose daily labour kept food and water systems alive may appear faintly or not at all compared with those buried with fine goods. This imbalance is not only a problem for researchers, it is a human lesson about memory. History often preserves the durable signs of status more clearly than the breath of the many. Jade survives better than a spoken kindness. A rich tomb survives better than a tired hand. A symbol placed with an elite person may travel farther through time than the name of the worker who helped make it. So when we look at Liangzhu graves, we are not only looking at ancient inequality, we are also looking at the unequal survival of evidence itself. Before later China would preserve names through writing and court tradition, this older world preserved difference through matter. Some dead were surrounded by objects that made their position visible across thousands of years. Others returned to the earth with fewer signs, and therefore with less chance of being noticed by the distant future. This does not make their lives less real. It only means the ground speaks unevenly. The city of Jade was built by many bodies, but archaeology often hears most clearly from the places where wealth gathered. That quiet unfairness belongs to the story. It reminds us that a nameless civilization can still contain hierarchy, and that a vanished society can leave behind not only beauty, but the first still shadows of human inequality. A rich grave can appear calm after thousands of years, but it is never neutral. It is a place where the living once made choices about the dead, and those choices became evidence. In Liangzhu, the graves that hold many fine jade objects draw the eye first because they are dense with durable material. They seem to speak louder than simpler burials, not because the people in simpler graves mattered less in life, but because fewer lasting things remained with them. This is one of the quiet difficulties of archaeology. The past does not preserve every person with equal clarity. It often preserves what was hardest, rarest, most protected, or most connected to status. Jade can survive where cloth, wood, food, speech, and daily tenderness vanish. A carefully furnished burial can cross time more strongly than an ordinary working life. For that reason, the graves of Liangzhu must be read with both attention and humility. They show that some people were placed in death with objects requiring great labour. They show that wealth, symbol, and social difference were present in the burial record. They do not show the full moral world of the community. They do not tell us how people explain difference, whether they accepted it quietly, contested it, inherited it, feared it, or understood it through obligations that are now lost. The evidence allows us to see inequality as pattern, not as a complete spoken system. This matters because the title asks about an entire civilization that vanished without a name, and a civilization is never only its grand objects. It is also the many people whose lives made those objects possible. Someone had to grow food, someone had to manage water, someone had to carry earth, someone had to shape tools, prepare materials, maintain paths, tend children, bury relatives, and repeat work that left little trace. The origin of human society lies in these ordinary tasks before it appears in elite graves. The body needs food before it can build symbols. The child needs care before a craft tradition can continue. The dead need living hands before burial can become a social act. Yet when we meet Liangzhu through the ground, the people with the greatest material signs often stand closest to the surface of knowledge. The many others remain dimmer. This does not make their presence imaginary. It makes them harder to recover. A simple grave, a fragment of pottery, a worn tool, a post hole, or a layer of worked soil can sometimes speak for lives without ornament, but they speak softly. They do not draw attention the way polished jade does. The result is a strange imbalance. A society built by many bodies may be remembered through the objects of a few. That imbalance is not unique to Liangzhu. It runs through much of human history. Kings, elites, ritual specialists, wealthy lineages, and people buried with durable goods often leave heavier marks than farmers, builders, craft workers, and children. But in a nameless early civilization, the imbalance feels sharper, because even the powerful dead have lost their own names. Their jade remains, but their voices are gone too. The difference between rich and poor, visible and faint, does not restore a living biography to anyone. It only shows that social layers existed within the silence. This is why Liangzhu should not be romanticized as a peaceful jade dream, nor reduced to a simple story of domination. Both would be too certain. The safer truth is more measured. The burial record suggests hierarchy. It suggests that some people or groups had greater access to valued objects and perhaps to ritual importance. It also suggests that the society had enough organized labor to make such differences materially visible. But the emotional texture of that world is beyond reach. We cannot know how ordinary people felt when elite graves were prepared. We cannot know how children learned the signs of rank. We cannot know whether jade inspired awe, duty, fear, belonging, or meanings for which no modern word fits. What remains is the structure of difference after the language of difference has disappeared. In that structure, Liangzhu becomes deeply human. It reminds us that early civilization was not only cooperation with water and soil, it was also the beginning of unequal memory, where some lives were surrounded by lasting signs, while others survived only through the quieter evidence of work, settlement, and earth. The graves of Liangzhu leave us with a quiet unease, because they show both presence and absence at the same time. Presence because bodies were placed, objects were chosen, and social difference entered the ground in durable form. Absence because the people themselves do not return as speakers of their own lives. A rich burial may seem to give us more, yet even there the centre is missing. We may see jade, pottery, arrangement, position, and material care, but we do not hear the name. We do not hear the words that explain why one person received many objects while another received few. We do not hear how a child learned that some graves mattered more than others, or how a community understood the line between ordinary death and honoured death. The evidence is strong enough to show hierarchy, but not strong enough to turn hierarchy into a complete story of belief. That boundary is important. It keeps the vanished civilization human rather than theatrical. Liangzhu was not only a place of impressive craft and water management, it was also a place where people were remembered differently, and where that difference survived unevenly. The human origin behind this is ancient and simple. Every society must face death, because every body that works, eats, carries, plants, polishes, and remembers will eventually stop. Biological life ends, but social life answers. The living choose where to place the dead. They choose whether to include objects, whether to mark the place, whether to return to it, whether to let memory stay close to daily life or move into special ground. In Liangzhu, those choices seem to have been shaped by rank or status, because not all graves held the same kind of material wealth. This tells us something about the living as much as the dead. It suggests that social order had become strong enough to follow a person into burial. A field can show how people fed bodies. A grave can show how they organized memory after bodies were gone. Together, they reveal a society with both practical and symbolic structure, yet the ordinary people remain difficult to see. The worker who carried earth may have shaped the city more than a single jade object did, but the jade object survives more clearly. The farmer whose harvest supported craft may appear only through traces of rice, agriculture, soil, tools, or settlement remains. The person who taught a child where to step in wet ground may have left no direct trace at all. This is not because these lives were empty. It is because material survival favours some forms of life over others. In that way, archaeology teaches a sober lesson about history. What lasts is not always what mattered most to daily existence. Sometimes what lasts is what was hardest, richest, most protected, or most deliberately buried. Liangzhu's elite graves therefore shine with meaning, but they also cast a shadow over the many unnamed lives around them. To listen carefully, we must hold both. We can acknowledge the importance of jade-rich burials without letting them become the whole civilization. We can see social inequality without pretending to know every rule that supported it. We can recognize that power probably shaped memory while admitting that the personal voices of both powerful and ordinary people have vanished. This is the first silence of inequality. Not only that people lived differently, but that the traces of their lives survived differently. Before later written histories preserved names through lineages, courts, and inscriptions, Liangzhu left a more fragile arrangement. Status entered the ground through objects, but identity did not fully cross time. The jade remained beside the dead, while the spoken name dissolved. The grave remained as pattern, while the person became unreachable. This does not make the story less valuable. It makes it more truthful. A nameless civilization can still teach us that memory is never evenly distributed, that labor and honor do not always leave equal marks, and that the past often reaches us through the materials of those who had more. As the story moves outward from graves into the wider human world, Liangzhu asks to be understood not as an isolated wonder, but as one local answer to a question many early societies faced. How can people build order, meaning, and difference before history learns to preserve their names? Liangzhu becomes easier to understand when it is placed beside the wider human story, not above it and not outside it. It was not a lost wonder standing alone in a world of emptiness. It was one local expression of a much broader human pattern. People in different landscapes slowly learning how to stay, grow food, organize labor, bury the dead, mark value, and make memory visible through matter. In other river valleys and fertile regions, early communities also faced the same basic problems of the body. They needed food that could return with the seasons. They needed shelter strong enough to protect sleep. They needed ways to pass knowledge to children before older hands were gone. They needed social rules, whether spoken formally or carried through habit, so that work did not begin from nothing every morning. These needs were shared, but the answers were never identical. In some places, irrigation, grain storage, writing, temples, trade, or kingship became especially visible. In the lower Yangtze, water, rice, jade, burial difference, and a built landscape left the clearer traces. This does not make Liangzhu greater or lesser than other early centres. Ranking ancient societies often tells us more about modern imagination than about the past. A fairer view is slower. Human civilization did not begin once, in one place, then spread as a single finished design. It emerged in different forms where people met particular environments with inherited knowledge and collective labor. Liangzhu belonged to that deep process. Its world was shaped by wet lowlands, rice agriculture, and the need to organize life around water. The ancient Nile, the Tigris and Euphrates, the Indus, the Yellow River, Mesoamerican landscapes, Andean highlands, and many other regions each created their own pressures and possibilities. The point is not to collapse them into one story. The point is to notice that human beings, carrying the same fragile bodies, repeatedly found ways to make place into memory. A field is never only food once generations have worked it. A wall is never only earth once people return to repair it. A burial is never only a pit once the living place meaning around the dead. A crafted object is never only material once time, skill, and status gather inside it. Liangzhu stands within this pattern, but with its own voice missing. That absence makes comparison delicate. Later civilizations often left inscriptions, lists, myths, legal records, or names that allow modern people to feel closer to them. Liangzhu left stronger material form than verbal explanation. It asks to be understood through archaeology rather than through self-description. This is why it matters for the phrase "before China." The deeper history of the region was not waiting silently for dynasties to begin. It was already full of local experiments in settlement, authority, craft, farming, and ritual life. Later, Chinese history would become vast, written, remembered, and debated through texts. But beneath that written surface were older cultural landscapes, whose full names did not survive. Liangzhu is one of the most powerful reminders that the roots of a historical world can grow from more than one direction. It warns us against a simple beginning. There was no single morning when complexity first entered this land. There were long generations of bodies learning wet ground, hands shaping hard stone, families depending on harvest, communities marking death, and social orders forming before they could be recorded in a way we can still read. In the larger human story, Liangzhu therefore teaches a calm lesson. Civilization is not only the moment when people write themselves into history, it is also the slower moment when people arrange life so carefully that even after their words vanish, the ground still remembers their effort. When Liangzhu is placed in the wider human story, its importance becomes quieter and more solid. It does not need to be presented as the first of everything, or as a secret source from which later worlds simply descended. That kind of claim would ask more from the evidence than the evidence can give. The more careful view is also more meaningful. Liangzhu shows that early complexity in East Asia did not belong to one river, one people, one later dynasty, or one simple line of origin. It belonged to a broad landscape of experiments, where different communities learned different ways to live with soil, water, plants, tools, animals, memory, and death. The lower Yangtze was one of those landscapes. Its answer was shaped by wet ground and rice, by water control and jade, by graves that show difference, and by a city whose name has not survived in its own words. Other regions answered their own problems differently. Some became known through writing earlier. Some left monumental buildings more visible to later eyes. Some were remembered through kings, temples, law, or conquest. Liangzhu left a more silent record, but silence should not be confused with weakness. It left order without explanation, craft without translation, power without a known ruler's voice, and memory without a recovered self-name. That makes it especially useful for understanding how deep the human past really is. Human beings did not wait for writing before becoming historical beings. They were already historical because they inherited choices from the dead and passed consequences to the young. A child born into a rice landscape did not begin life in an empty world. The field already carried earlier labor. The path already carried earlier feet. The grave already held earlier loss. The jade form already carried earlier training. This is how civilization grows before texts make it visible in familiar ways. It grows through repeated arrangements that outlive the people who first made them. In this sense, Liangzhu belongs beside other early centers not as a rival in a race, but as evidence of a shared human capacity. In many places, people found that staying in one landscape created new possibilities and new burdens. More food could support more people, but also more dependence. More coordination could protect a community, but also create hierarchy. More memory could bind generations, but also divide those remembered richly from those remembered faintly. Liangzhu carries all these human tensions in its own local form. It shows the promise of water management and the cost of maintaining it. It shows the beauty of craft and the social difference hidden behind that beauty. It shows a center strong enough to shape land, yet unable to preserve its own voice across the long distance. This wider view also helps protect the phrase before China from becoming misleading. It does not mean that later China appeared from nothing. It means that the land later gathered into Chinese history contained older layers, some written, some unwritten, some remembered, some nearly lost. Liangzhu was one of those older layers. It belonged to the deep foundation from which later histories would arise, though not in a simple straight line that can be drawn without uncertainty. Cultures change, people move, practices continue, meanings fade, and later societies inherit landscapes without always remembering who first shaped them. The history of any large civilization is therefore not a single route but a whole underground system. Some routes are thick and named. Others are fine, broken or visible only where the soil has been carefully opened. Liangzhu is one of the places where that older root system can be seen. It reminds us that before a civilization becomes a name in books, it may already have been a set of hands in mud, bodies in rain, harvests in storage, graves in chosen ground, and stone polished until it could carry meaning longer than breath. Liangzhu also changes how we imagine the beginning of Chinese history itself. A simple story wants a single origin. One river, one people, one dynasty, one first moment when everything important begins. The deeper record is less simple and more human. Long before later states wrote names into bronze, bamboo, silk, or paper, different regions were already forming their own ways of living. The Yellow River world would later become central to many traditional accounts of early Chinese civilization, but the lower Yangtze shows that complexity was also growing far to the south and east, in wet rice landscapes where water, jade, burial, and planned settlement shaped a different kind of early order. This does not mean Liangzhu was secretly the whole beginning, or that later China can be reduced to Liangzhu alone. It means the roots were multiple. Some roots became famous because later writing carried them forward. Some roots became faint because their names did not survive. Liangzhu belongs to the second kind, yet the traces it left are too substantial to ignore. It reminds us that a historical civilization is often built above older worlds whose people did not disappear neatly from the earth, but whose languages, names, and meanings may have changed beyond recognition. Culture does not always end like a door closing. It can thin, move, mix, transform, or be absorbed into later patterns. The same land can hold one memory on the surface and another beneath it. A later farmer may work soil once shaped by people whose name is gone. A later community may inherit water routes, sacred places, materials, or habits without preserving the original explanation. Human history is full of such quiet continuities and breaks. The body keeps living in landscapes that memory has partly forgotten. This is why Liangzhu should be placed in world history with care. It stands beside other early centers as evidence that human beings repeatedly found ways to build order from local conditions. But it also stands as a warning against smooth timelines. Written history often begins after much of the human work has already happened. By the time a name enters a record, generations of nameless people may have already cleared ground, shaped fields, tested tools, buried ancestors, taught children, and formed the habits that make later complexity possible. The beginning we can read is not always the beginning that mattered most to human life. In the lower Yangtze, the origin was not a single royal declaration. It was water held for rice, labour held by expectation, jade held in burial, and memory held imperfectly by earth. This wider view gives the title its careful meaning. Before China, there were people whose world was not empty, not primitive in a careless sense, and not waiting passively for later history to begin. They were already making a civilization in their own landscape, under their own conditions, with forms of value we can partly see but not fully hear. Their city shows that early order in East Asia was regional, layered, and unevenly remembered. It asks us to look below the familiar names without turning the older past into fantasy. What we find there is not a lost empire with a secret message for us. We find something quieter, a real society whose achievements survived better than its identity. The jade stayed. The earthworks stayed. The water-shaped landscape left signs. But the name did not travel with them. In the wider human story, that loss is not an exception. It is one of the ordinary tragedies of time. Many beginnings are buried under the names that came later. Liangzhu helps us feel that truth without needing to exaggerate it. It shows that a civilization can stand near the roots of a great historical tradition and still remain partly outside the language of memory. It can be foundational without being fully traceable. It can be real without being fully known. The decline of Liangzhu must be approached more slowly than a story of sudden ruin. A vanished city invites the mind to imagine one final flood, one last night, one moment when people looked at the water and understood that their world could not continue. But archaeology does not give us that kind of scene. It gives layers, traces, dates, sediments, settlement changes, and signs that a complex society tied to wetland faced pressure near the end of its flourishing. The safest way to speak is not to say that a single event erased everyone. The safer way is to say that environmental change, especially water-related stress, appears to have played an important role in the weakening or abandonment of the Liangzhu center. This matters because water was never only background in this story. It fed rice, shaped settlement, supported labor, and gave power its practical base. If the patterns of water changed beyond what people could manage, the change would have touched the body before it touched memory. A flooded field is not an abstract event. It is grain lost, storage threatened, paths broken, work repeated without reward, and children depending on adults who can no longer trust the season. The origin of human order is always tied to the need to make tomorrow livable. When tomorrow becomes uncertain again and again, even a strong order can begin to loosen. Studies of the Liangzhu landscape and later environmental records have led many researchers to consider heavy rainfall, flooding, sea level influence, river changes, or broader climatic instability as possible pressures. These ideas should be held as evidence-based hypotheses, not as a finished account of collapse. We do not know the voice of the person who decided to leave a house. We do not know whether families moved gradually, whether authority weakened first, whether floods damaged fields repeatedly, or whether several stresses met at once. Human societies rarely end for only one reason. They change through a braid of environment, food, leadership, belief, labor, population, and memory. Liangzhu may have suffered because the same wet world that made it fertile also made it vulnerable. That is not a dramatic twist added from outside. It is already present from the beginning. The people had built their order by learning water. They had raised ground, shaped flow, and made rice fields part of social life. But a system designed for expected water can be strained by water outside expectation. More intense rain, persistent flooding, or altered drainage could turn managed land into unstable land. A canal that once helped life might become insufficient. A bank that once held might need repair too often. A field that once produced might fail often enough to shake confidence. When food systems weaken, craft and ritual cannot remain untouched. Jade may survive in the ground, but the living society that supported jade workers depended on harvests, labor schedules, and stable communities. This is why the decline of Liangzhu should be seen through connection, not spectacle. Water touched rice, rice touched bodies, bodies touched labor, labor touched walls, graves, jade, and authority. If one link became uncertain, the whole arrangement could become more difficult to maintain. Yet even here, caution remains essential. Collapse does not necessarily mean every person died. Vanishing from a city does not mean vanishing from the human population. People may have moved, mixed with other communities, changed practices, or carried fragments of knowledge into later worlds without preserving the old center's name. The archaeological silence after Liangzhu is not the silence of a simple ending. It is the silence of transformation seen from too far away. What can be said is enough. A civilization built with water at its heart seems to have faced environmental pressures in which water again became decisive, not as a mythic punishment, but as a material force larger than human planning, and larger than any single memory trying to hold it. The end of Liangzhu is difficult because the evidence speaks in slow materials, while the human mind wants a human scene. Sediment can suggest flooding. Geological records can suggest periods of heavier rainfall or unstable water. Settlement patterns can suggest that people moved, abandoned certain places, or changed the way they lived. But none of these traces gives us a face at a doorway, a voice in a meeting, or a final sentence spoken beside a rising river. The distance between evidence and experience must be respected. A flood layer is not the same as a memory of fear. A change in settlement is not the same as a story of why a family left. A decline in a center is not proof that every person vanished. Careful history must stay with what can be supported. Liangzhu's society appears to have faced serious environmental stress, and because its life was deeply tied to water, that stress could have affected food, labor, authority, and the ability to maintain the built landscape. This is already enough to make the story sobering. The same system that allowed people to stay in wet ground depended on continued maintenance. A raised bank had to remain useful, a channel had to keep serving its purpose, fields had to keep producing, paths had to stay passable, storage had to remain safe from dampness and damage. If rainfall became too intense, if floods returned too often, or if drainage conditions changed in ways people could not easily correct, the pressure would not have fallen on one object alone. It would have moved through the whole living order. The human body would have felt it first as harder work, less secure food, more damaged ground, and less confidence in what the next season would bring. Civilization may look strong in ruins, but while it lives, it is always dependent on the fragile continuity of ordinary days. Grain must ripen, water must be held or released at the right time, children must be fed, workers must be available, leaders or organizers must still be trusted enough for people to return to shared tasks. When environmental pressure grows, each of these links can become weaker. This does not mean Liangzhu fell in a single dramatic collapse. It may have declined through repeated disruptions, gradual movement, shifting settlement, changing economic patterns, or a combination of causes that cannot be separated cleanly now. A society is not a stone bowl that breaks in one visible line. It is more like a woven mat. When some strands loosen, others may hold for a time. People adapt, repair, migrate, change customs, and carry knowledge elsewhere. The old center may lose importance before the people themselves disappear from the wider human story. This distinction matters for the title. Vanished without a name does not mean erased from biology. It means the social identity we call Liangzhu did not continue as a readable voice in later memory. People who once belonged to that world, or descended from people connected to it, may have entered other communities and later cultural landscapes in ways we cannot trace directly. Practices may have ended, changed, or been absorbed. The city could fall silent while human life continued around and beyond it. This is one of the cold truths of history. A civilization can lose its form without every life ending. A name can vanish while bodies keep moving through time. The lower Yangtze did not become empty because Liangzhu declined. But the organized world that built its jade-rich burials, waterworks, and central spaces no longer held the same visible shape. Environmental change may have been a major force in that transformation, especially because water had been so central from the beginning. Yet even here, the ending remains partly hidden. We see the after effects more clearly than the process. We see signs of strain more clearly than decisions. We see the silence after the city more clearly than the last efforts to maintain it. That silence is not permission to invent a catastrophe. It is an invitation to understand vulnerability. Liangzhu teaches that early civilization was not a guarantee against nature. It was a temporary arrangement with nature, maintained by human bodies, social memory, and seasons that could still change beyond expectation. The possible environmental decline of Liangzhu brings the whole story back to water, but now water has changed its meaning. Earlier, it was the condition that made rice fields fertile, settlements possible, and social coordination necessary. It was the force people learned to guide, slow, store, and live beside. Near the end of the Liangzhu world, water appears again as a possible pressure that exceeded the arrangements built around it. This does not need to be imagined as a single wall of flood destroying a city in one night. A slower image is more truthful. Rains may come too heavily, Wet ground may remain wet too long. Fields may become less reliable. Repairs may demand more effort than people can continue to give. A water system that once made life predictable may begin to feel like a burden that must be defended season after season. In such a situation, decline would not be only physical. It would enter the mind of a community through work, hunger, uncertainty, and weakening confidence in inherited methods. The human body always measures collapse before history names it. It measures collapse in grain that does not fill the store, in paths that cannot be crossed, in labour repeated without the old result, in children who still need food when the field has failed. Liangzhu's vulnerability was therefore tied to its achievement. The more deeply a society is woven into a landscape, the more powerful that landscape becomes in its fate. Water helped create the conditions for the Jade City, and water may have helped loosen those conditions when the balance changed. Yet even this should remain an open, careful explanation. Environment alone rarely carries the whole story of a society's transformation. Social authority may weaken when projects fail. Labour obligations may become harder to maintain. People may leave in smaller movements rather than in one great departure. Ritual practices may lose their setting when the central places no longer function as before. Craft production may shrink when food, labour, or patronage become uncertain. These processes can overlap until a once powerful centre no longer holds the same shape. Archaeology sees the result more clearly than the lived sequence. It sees abandonment, change, sediment, distribution, and silence. It does not hear the discussions, doubts, or practical decisions that may have taken people away from the centre. This is why the word vanished must be used with care. The society we call Liangzhu seems to have lost its visible form, but that does not mean its people simply disappeared from the human world. Bodies move, families join other communities, children grow into new customs, old meanings fade while habits continue in altered forms. Some knowledge may be carried forward without the old name attached to it. Some memories may become ordinary practice, then become unrecognizable after enough generations. In this way, a civilization can vanish as a named order while human life continues through change. That is a colder and more realistic loss than total destruction. It means the city can fall out of memory without the landscape becoming empty. It means jade can remain in graves while descendants, neighbours, or related communities move through histories that no longer preserve the original voice. The end of Liangzhu, then, should not be treated as a sealed answer. It is better understood as a narrowing of visibility. The water-shaped order that once supported walls, fields, burials, and jade no longer appears with the same strength. The name inside that order did not survive in a readable form. What remains is the trace of a society that reached a high level of organization, met pressures it could not fully overcome, and passed into a later world without carrying its own explanation intact. As the story turns toward that loss of name, the question becomes even quieter. When a civilization changes, moves, and dissolves, what exactly has vanished the people themselves, or the memory that once held them together? To vanish without a name is not the same as to vanish without a trace. Liangzhu did not leave us nothing. It left earth shaped by labour, water systems shaped by need, graves shaped by social difference, and jade shaped by patience. What it did not leave, at least in a form that can be read securely today, is a clear voice saying who its people believe themselves to be. That missing voice changes everything. A later dynasty can be approached through names, lineages, inscriptions, and remembered rulers. Liangzhu gives a different thread. It gives material order without self-explanation. It gives a civilization visible through consequences, not through testimony. The people may have had names for their homes, their leaders, their dead, their fields, their rivers, and their shared identity. They almost certainly lived in a world filled with speech, but speech is made of breath, and breath rarely crosses thousands of years unless it is fixed into durable writing or carried continuously by living memory. Here, that chain does not reach us clearly. The modern name Liangzhu helps researchers gather the evidence, but it is not the recovered name of a people speaking for themselves. It is a careful label placed after discovery, useful and necessary, yet still outside the vanished society's own language. This is why the loss is so quiet. The city did not need to be destroyed utterly for its name to disappear. A name can be lost through movement, transformation, absorption, broken tradition, or the long erosion of memory. Human life may continue while cultural identity changes beyond recognition. Families may move, children may grow inside new customs, old practices may survive only as altered habits, a burial form may cease. A craft tradition may weaken, a central place may no longer gather people as before. After enough generations, even descendants may no longer know the word their distant ancestors used for the old order. This is one of the deepest truths in human history. Our species begins in memory shared from body to body, voice to voice, hand to hand. A child learns where to walk, what to eat, whom to trust, and how to belong because others teach before written records exist. But that kind of memory is alive only while the chain remains unbroken. When the chain changes, the past can become present in fragments without remaining known by name. Liangzhu's traces are fragments on a grand scale. Walls, platforms, jade, graves, and waterworks show that a social world once had enough strength to organize many lives. Yet the identity that held that world together did not arrive intact in later history. That is why vanished must be understood carefully. It does not mean an empty land after Liangzhu. It does not mean a final silence of all people. It means the recognizable social form faded from view. The city stopped speaking through active use. The burial system no longer continued in the same visible way. The jade tradition lost the setting that made its meanings clear. The water-shaped center no longer stood as the same living order. Later histories rose over older layers, and the older layer became something archaeology would have to recover with tools rather than with inherited names. This loss is not rare. Many human groups have lived deeply, worked skillfully, taught children, buried the dead, and disappeared from written memory. The difference with Liangzhu is the scale of what remained. Its silence is surrounded by evidence of complexity, and that makes the missing name feel heavier. Achievement did not protect identity from time. The people shaped jade as if some meanings deserved permanence. They shaped water as if the future could be made more stable. They shaped graves as if the dead should remain within social order. Yet the word that may have gathered all of this into one living identity slipped away. What remains is a civilization we can see from outside, almost as if standing at the edge of a closed house after the voices have faded. The name Liangzhu is useful because it gives modern people a way to gather scattered evidence into one conversation. But usefulness is not the same as identity. The word belongs to archaeology, not necessarily to the people who lived inside that ancient world. This difference may seem small at first, yet it is central to the loss. When we say Liangzhu, we are naming a culture from the outside, after its own voice has become unreachable. We are drawing a circle around walls, graves, jade, waterworks, settlements, and patterns in the soil. The people themselves may have drawn a different circle. They may have understood belonging through kinship, place, ritual, labor, ancestry, river, or words that no longer exist in any recoverable form. A civilization can be real in the ground and still remain unnamed in its own language. That is one reason vanish does not mean simple disappearance. It can mean that the living thread connecting name, memory, and community broke, or changed until later people no longer knew how to follow it. Human beings live inside names because names hold relationships. A child learns not only the sound of a place, but what that place means, where food grows, where the dead rest, where water is dangerous, where elders gather, where certain objects must be handled with care. Names make the world familiar. They shorten memory into sound, but if the community changes, moves, blends with others, or loses the old center of life, names can weaken. A place may still exist, but its old meaning may fade. A practice may continue in altered form, but the explanation may be forgotten. A group may have descendants, neighbors, or cultural echoes, yet the original identity may not survive as a clear line. This is likely how many ancient worlds disappeared from history. They did not always end with fire, violence, or total death. Often they ended by becoming something else, while the word that once held them together dissolved. Liangzhu asks us to sit with that slower kind of loss. The city's material remains show organization, but organization is not the same as continuity. Water systems can fall out of use. Burial customs can cease. craft traditions can change. Elite symbols can lose authority if the social order around them weakens. A jade object may remain perfect in shape while its meaning becomes unreachable. This contrast reveals a deep human vulnerability. Our bodies can make things that outlast us, but our meanings depend on living chains of teaching. The hand can polish stone for the future, but the meaning of the stone must be renewed by voices, gestures, and shared belief. If that renewal stops, the object becomes durable and mute. It remains as evidence, not as explanation. Before later China became a written and remembered historical world, Liangzhu had already entered this danger. Its people built forms that could survive physically, yet their own self-description did not survive in a readable way. That does not make them less historical. It shows that history is wider than writing, but also that memory without writing is exposed to time. The ordinary worker, the skilled jade maker, the person buried with many objects, the farmer watching wet fields, the child learning the boundaries of home, all belong to a world filled with language while it lived. None of that language reaches us directly. We meet the society after the words have fallen away. What remains is not emptiness. It is a landscape of evidence, without a recovered voice. And perhaps that is the quietest meaning of vanishing without a name. Not that nothing was left, but that everything left behind must now be understood without the one thing human beings most often use to tell others who they are. A civilization can lose its name in more than one way. It can be forgotten by those who come later. It can be renamed from the outside. It can dissolve into other communities until the old boundary no longer has meaning. It can leave behind objects so strong that they survive, while the words that once explained them fade like breath. Liangzhu stands in that difficult space. It is not gone because nothing remains. It is gone because the remaining things no longer arrive with their own living explanation. The city can be mapped, the waterworks can be studied, the burials can be compared, the jade can be described, measured, and placed within archaeological patterns. Yet the centre of identity remains absent. We do not know the self-name of the people who built and maintained this world. We do not know how they placed themselves among neighbouring communities, how they described their ancestors, or what word held together land, water, dead, living, and sacred objects. That absence is not a small detail. It is the difference between seeing a house from the outside and being invited to hear the voices inside it. Human beings have always lived by more than survival alone. From the earliest beginnings of our species, belonging has been one of the ways the body becomes less alone. A child is born into sounds already waiting. Names of people, names of places, names for danger, names for food, names for the dead. These sounds help turn a landscape into a home. They make memory portable. They allow one generation to hand the next not only tools and fields, but a sense of who they are. When those sounds vanish, the material world remains, but it is changed. A grave becomes a pattern. A city becomes a site. A treasured object becomes a category. The living relationship has been replaced by observation. This is what makes Liangzhu both precious and unreachable. Its remains are rich enough to show that early civilization in the lower Yangtze was complex, organized, and deeply tied to water and jade. But richness of material does not restore lost speech. In fact, the richness makes the loss more visible. If Liangzhu had left only a few scattered fragments, the missing name might feel expected. But because it left so much evidence of coordination, status, craft, and planned space, the silence feels heavier. It reminds us that achievement and remembrance are not the same thing. A society can build carefully and still fail to be remembered in its own terms. It can shape an environment and still be reshaped by time. It can place meaning into stone and still lose the chain that once made that meaning clear. This is not only an ancient problem, it is a human problem. Every community depends on continuity. It cannot fully control. Names survive only if someone keeps speaking them, writing them, inheriting them, or attaching them to institutions strong enough to endure. Without that renewal, even important names can become faint. Liangzhu's people may have continued through descendants, movement, mixture, or transformation, but the social form that once gathered them did not remain visible as a self-told identity. Their world became readable only through archaeology. And archaeology is powerful but incomplete. It can recover shape, sequence, material, and relation. It cannot fully recover what vanished from mouths, ears, and shared understanding. So the phrase vanished without a name should be heard with care. It does not mean a magical disappearance. It means a loss of historical selfhood. The people were real. Their labor was real. Their city was real. Their water systems and jade traditions were real. But the name that may have made all these things one living world did not cross time intact. What remains is a civilization seen through its own afterimage: green stone, shaped earth, silent graves, and the unsettling knowledge that human memory can be far more fragile than the things human hands create. Liangzhu leaves behind more than a question of disappearance. It leaves a lesson about what civilization is when the familiar signs of kings, written chronicles, and remembered dynasties are not yet available. For a long time, many people learned to recognize civilization by looking for texts, rulers, armies, palaces, and named states. Those signs are important when they exist, but Liangzhu asks for a wider and calmer understanding. A civilization can also be seen in the way people arrange water, organize labor, shape valuable materials, bury the dead with visible differences, and make a landscape carry memory across generations. Before later China became a world of written histories and named political traditions, people in the lower Yangtze had already built a social order around rice, wetland, jade, and collective work. The value of that knowledge is not that it gives a dramatic secret. It gives something more useful. It corrects a narrow habit of thought. It reminds us that human history is deeper than the names that survive. The beginning of a historical world is not always the same as the beginning of human intelligence, human cooperation, or human meaning. Long before a court writes its record, a family may already know how water rises, a village may already hold a burial ground in memory, a craft worker may already carry a skill learned from older hands, a community may already expect certain people to guide labor, certain objects to mark status, and certain places to be treated with unusual care. These are not small things. They are the quiet foundations beneath later history. Liangzhu helps us see those foundations because it stands in an older layer where material evidence is strong, but self-explanation is missing. That combination teaches humility. It shows how much can be known through earth and stone, and how much must remain unclaimed. The listener should not leave with the idea that Liangzhu has been solved as a neat story. The safer lesson is that evidence can be meaningful without being complete. A wall can show organization without telling us every rule. A grave can show difference without giving a full biography. A jade object can show value without translating belief. A water system can show coordination without naming the authority behind it. This is not a weakness of careful history. It is the reason careful history protects the past from being turned into fantasy. The people of Liangzhu deserve that restraint. They were not props in a mystery. They were human beings who lived in a demanding landscape, fed bodies, taught children, shaped objects, managed danger, and placed memory into the ground as best their world allowed. Their lives connect back to the oldest human beginning, the need to survive together. Every society, ancient or modern, begins with bodies that cannot endure alone. The body needs food, warmth, sleep, care, and protection from forces larger than itself. Culture grows as one answer to that weakness. It teaches people how to repeat useful actions, how to remember danger, how to divide work, how to honor the dead, and how to give meaning to materials that would otherwise be only stone, wood, water, or soil. Liangzhu was one such answer, shaped by the lower Yangtze. Its jade cities were not outside nature. They were built because nature was generous and dangerous at the same time. Its achievement was not that it escaped the human condition, but that it organized that condition into lasting forms. And its loss teaches the other side of the same truth. Lasting forms do not guarantee lasting names. A civilization may build with great care, yet the future may receive only the outline. In that outline, there is still value. It teaches us to listen slowly, to separate evidence from invention, and to remember that the nameless dead were not silent in life. They once belonged to households, seasons, duties, and landscapes, even if only their strongest materials now remain to speak across time. The story of Liangzhu, is also a mirror, held gently toward the present. It shows that people do not build only to solve the needs of one day. They build because the body is temporary, and human beings have always known this in some wordless way. A field is planted for a season that has not yet arrived. A wall is raised for rains that have not yet fallen. A child is taught a skill because one day the older hand will no longer guide the younger one. A burial is prepared because the living cannot accept death as only the stopping of breath. A jade object is shaped because some meanings are treated as worthy of time beyond hunger. These acts may belong to the deep past, but they are not strange to us. Every generation still tries to leave order behind itself. People build homes, write records, save names, protect photographs, repair graves, teach languages, keep family stories, and create institutions that may continue after their own bodies are gone. The difference is that modern people often imagine memory as safer than it really is. We live surrounded by words, images, dates, and records, so it can feel as if being remembered is almost guaranteed. Liangzhu tells a calmer and colder truth. Memory is not guaranteed by effort. It is not guaranteed by beauty. It is not guaranteed by organization. Even a society that shaped water, built a center, marked social rank, and carved jade with extraordinary patience could still lose the voice by which it named itself. That lesson does not make human work meaningless. It makes human work more tender. It reminds us that the value of a life is not measured only by whether the distant future can read it clearly. The people of Liangzhu did not live in order to become evidence. They lived to survive their seasons, feed their children, honor their dead, maintain their places, and follow meanings that belong to their own world. We meet them after almost everything soft has disappeared, but the disappearance of softness does not cancel the reality of what was lived. The human origin inside the story remains the same. Fragile bodies making shared forms so that life can continue a little farther than one person can carry it alone. In that sense, Liangzhu is not only about ancient China's deeper past. It is about the human condition beneath all civilizations. We build because we are vulnerable. We remember because we lose. We give meaning to objects because breath cannot stay. We organize water, food, work, and death because nature does not arrange itself around human comfort. The lower Yangtze made these truths especially visible. Its wet land offered fertility, but only through labor. Its water gave life, but only under careful attention. Its jade endured, but only after bodies gave hours to resistance. Its city became visible to the future, but not as a voice fully restored. This is the balance the listener can carry from Liangzhu without needing a full certainty. The past is knowable in fragments, and fragments can still teach. A fragment of jade can teach patience. A buried platform can teach coordination. A grave can teach that societies remember unequally. A waterwork can teach that power begins where human bodies gather around a shared danger. A missing name can teach humility. Together, these traces ask us to treat ancient people not as puzzles made for our curiosity, but as human beings who stood in the same broad stream of need, fear, care, and hope that still runs through us. The value of Liangzhu is not that it solves the beginning of China in one clean line. It is that it widens the beginning. It lets us see that before the names that became famous, there were older lives working inside local worlds, shaping materials, solving problems, and making meanings that did not all survive. It also reminds us to be careful with our own age. We may leave more records than they did, but we do not control how future minds will read us. They may find our buildings and miss our tenderness. They may find our tools and misunderstand our fears. They may preserve what was powerful and lose what was kind. Liangzhu, in its silence, teaches that the future is never simply a container waiting to keep us whole. It receives what survives, and survival is uneven. Yet even uneven survival can carry value. A nameless civilization can still offer a lesson. What we make may outlast us, but what we mean will always depend on the fragile chain of living memory. Liangzhu leaves us at the edge of a simple but difficult lesson. Human beings often believe that what is carefully made will be carefully remembered. A wall seems to promise endurance. A water system seems to promise order. A grave seems to promise that someone mattered. A jade object seems to promise that meaning has found a body strong enough to cross time. But the past does not keep every promise in the way people hope. It keeps materials unevenly. It keeps stone better than speech, earthworks better than tenderness, objects better than names. In the lower Yangtze, a society once gathered around rice fields, wet ground, labour, burial, water and jade. It shaped a world real enough to leave traces that can still be studied. Yet the voice that once made that world familiar from within has not survived in a form we can hear. This is not only a loss for archaeology, it is a lesson in humility for every age that thinks its own memory is secure. The people of Liangzhu were not waiting to become a mystery. They were living under the same broad conditions that have always shaped human life. Bodies needed food, families needed shelter, children needed teaching, communities needed rules, habits, and shared expectations. The dead needed places in memory. The living needed reasons to keep repairing the world after rain, fatigue, hunger, and loss. Out of these needs came forms of order that were larger than one person and longer than one lifetime. That is what civilization means at its quietest level. It is not only a monument, a ruler, a written law, or a famous name. It is the fragile body learning how not to be alone against the world. It is memory made social. It is labour repeated until a place becomes home. Liangzhu's jade cities matter because they show this process before later written history made origins appear cleaner than they really were. They remind us that the roots of a great historical world can be multiple, regional, and partly nameless. They remind us that early complexity did not need to look like later states in order to be real. A society could manage water without leaving a royal chronicle. It could value jade without leaving a dictionary of symbols. It could bury some dead with extraordinary care without giving us their biographies. It could build a centre strong enough to shape land and still lose the name by which its people may have known themselves. The most honest ending is therefore not a claim that everything is solved. It is a slower recognition that knowledge and mystery can exist together without becoming fantasy. We know enough to respect Liangzhu as a major early civilization of the lower Yangtze. We know enough to see water, rice, labour, social difference, craft, and environmental vulnerability as central to its story. We also know the boundary where evidence stops. That boundary should not disappoint us. It should teach us how to listen. The past does not become more valuable when we force it to answer every question. Sometimes it becomes more valuable when we accept what it can say and protect what it cannot say from careless invention. For the listener tonight, Liangzhu offers a calm gift. It shows that human life has always been an effort to place meaning inside things that may outlast the body. A field may outlast the farmer, a wall may outlast the builder, a jade object may outlast the hand that polished it. But meaning needs living memory, and living memory is delicate. It must be spoken, taught, repeated, renewed, and carried by people who themselves will pass away. When that chain breaks, even a civilization of patient stone can become silent. Yet silence is not nothing. In silence, Liangzhu still teaches. It teaches that the nameless were not empty. It teaches that ordinary labour can become the foundation of extraordinary history. It teaches that water, food, death, craft and memory are not separate subjects but parts of one human condition. It teaches that what we inherit from the deep past is not only information, but responsibility. The responsibility to speak carefully, to avoid false certainty, and to remember that every ancient ruin was once a living world of breath. So the jade remains, the earth remains, the water-shaped memory remains, and the name is gone. And if a civilization can leave so much behind, yet lose the word that once held its people together, what is it that truly allows human beings to be remembered?